The silent cry for help. The Zeta-9 spaceport, nestled on the fringes of a star system, was an organized chaos of intergalactic trade. Ships from dozens of worlds landed every hour, unloading goods from distant planets, while other vessels prepared for their next journey into the vast unknown. The docking bays echoed with the hum of engines, the hiss of airlock sealing, and the metallic clink of cargo containers being loaded and unloaded. Rena, a young Ivorian, stood at the edge of the loading dock, watching the activity around her. Her species was unlike any others in the galaxy. Her skin was translucent, glowing faintly with an iridescent blue hue that shimmered with the movement of light. The Ivorians were a proud people, brilliant in their engineering and technology, but their physiology made them vulnerable. They were fragile, their bodies susceptible to external harm, and even the slightest wound could lead to disastrous consequences. Rena had always felt the weight of this fragility, but it was something she had learned to accept, pushing it to the back of her mind as she focused on her task. She had been assigned to help manage the cargo for the day shift at the spaceport, a job that required meticulous attention to detail. As a young Ivorian, she had dreamed of greater things, of exploring the galaxies, pushing the boundaries of science and technology, and proving her worth to her people. But for now, this was what she had to do. She was careful, methodical in her movements, ensuring each shipment was properly cataloged and directed to its correct destination. As she moved swiftly between containers, her translucent skin caught the harsh light, reflecting a rainbow of colors that danced across the metallic surfaces of the dock. The other workers gave her a wide berth, stepping aside as she moved, as if her presence were something to be avoided. Rena didn't mind. She was used to it. The Ivorian skin secreted a mild but potent acid, enough to corrode standard protective gear and cause harm to others if touched. The other workers, mostly human, were aware of the danger, and though they were polite, they never ventured too close. This solitude, though lonely, was something Rena had learned to live with. It gave her time to think, to dream about a world beyond this cold, metallic spaceport. It was on this otherwise ordinary day that the unthinkable happened. The malfunction occurred without warning. A loading drone, a large mechanical arm used to move cargo with precision, suddenly jerked and spun wildly. Its sensors scrambled by a sudden power surge. The drone veered off course, swinging a massive cargo container toward Rena with terrifying speed. She barely had time to react. She saw the container coming, too large and too fast to dodge, and in a split second, she made a desperate attempt to leap out of the way. But it was too late. The heavy container struck her leg with bone-crushing force, pinning her against a stack of smaller crates. The shockwave reverberated through her body, sending a violent jolt through her crystalline structure. A sharp pain shot up from her leg, and Rena screamed, the sound echoing through the otherwise busy dock. Her crystalline skin, usually radiant, cracked under the impact. Fractures spread across her lower body, and droplets of acidic fluid began to leak from the new wounds, sizzling against the metal floor. The pain was unbearable, but the real threat was the damage to her body. The Ivorians had evolved to be incredibly resilient in many ways, but their physical form was fragile, like glass. Cracks in their skin could lead to catastrophic consequences if not treated immediately. Rena gasped for breath, trying to free herself, but her body was pinned, unable to move. Her vision blurred from the pain, and the world around her started to fade in and out of focus. Desperately, she reached out with trembling hands, calling for help. "Help! Someone! Please!" she cried, her voice tinged with panic. Her cries echoed across the bay, but no one came. Workers paused, glancing in her direction, but none moved toward her. A few looked nervously at one another, but all of them stepped back. A group of Centurion dock supervisors, alien creatures with their sharp, angular bodies and multiple limbs, took one glance at the scene and scurried away. They were not equipped to deal with an Ivorian injury, and their programming made it clear. Any contact with an Ivorian's acid could damage their own systems. They avoided the situation altogether. A few Relian traders, humanoid beings with elongated faces and intricate facial markings, hurried past, their environmental suits sealing them off from the world around them. They did not even slow their pace. Reyna's heart sank. No one was willing to help. It seemed that her people's fragility had sealed her fate. Reyna felt the cold metal against her back as the pain intensified. Her mind raced. Would she die here, alone in this vast spaceport? Her family, her dreams of exploring the stars, would it all end in this cold, heartless dock? She had always been told that the galaxy was a place for exploration and wonder, but in her darkest hour, it felt more like a place of indifference. Her skin began to dull, the radiant glow fading to a sickly gray. The once shimmering cracks in her body spread, as though her very essence were draining away with each passing second. The acid continued to leak from the wounds, leaving small wisps of smoke where the fluid hit the floor. It was the last sign that she was still alive. Then, just when Reyna thought all hope was lost, something changed. She heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, loud, steady, purposeful. Someone was running toward her. At first, she thought it might be another fleeting glance from one of the traders or dock supervisors, but the footsteps grew closer, more urgent. Her vision blurred further, and for a moment, she thought she might be hallucinating. The world around her grew darker as her body weakened, but then, through the haze, she saw a figure, a human, clad in modified medical gear, rushing toward her. The human's face was hard to make out, the visor of his helmet reflecting the harsh overhead lights, but the determination in his movements was clear. "Hold on," a calm, confident voice called out through the din. "I'm here to help." Reyna felt a flicker of hope stir in her chest, the first real sensation of warmth and possibility since the accident. Could this human really help her? Would someone, anyone, finally come to her aid? As darkness began to take over, she clung to that small spark of hope, waiting for the human medic to reach her. The human medic's resolve. James Miller had never planned on a life in space. He had been just another human medical student, toiling away in the classrooms and learning about human anatomy, alien biology, and the many diseases that plagued both. His fascination with xenobiology, specifically the medical challenges of treating non-carbon-based life forms, had led him to a niche specialty. But even then, he had never imagined he would be working in a far-flung spaceport like Zeta 9. It was supposed to be a temporary assignment, a brief internship before heading back to Earth to continue his research. When the emergency alert had flashed across his tablet, his lunch had nearly fallen from his hand. The words Ivorian critical injury had been enough. As a human, James had been taught from a young age that adaptability was one of humanity's greatest strengths. Humans had the remarkable ability to learn, grow, and adjust to situations that would leave other species paralyzed. In his mind, this was no different. His training in xenobiology had been rigorous, and he had learned that if given the right tools and knowledge, humans could treat almost any life form, provided they understood it well enough. The alert told him everything he needed to know. An Ivorian had been injured at the docking bay, with fractures to their crystalline structure. That was all it took for James to spring into action. He had no time to think about the danger or the risks. He simply grabbed his gear, suited up in his protective medical suit, designed to withstand the corrosive effects of Ivorian acid, and sprinted out of the break room. His instincts kicked in as he moved with precision, already mentally preparing himself for the unique physiology he was about to encounter. As he ran, James heard the voice of his superior, Dr. Atal Andoran, echo down the corridor, calling after him. "Miller, wait. This is dangerous. The station isn't equipped for this." But James didn't slow down. His mind was focused on one thing. The Ivorian girl needed help. The medical team that specialized in treating Ivorian injuries was hours away. Reyna, if that was even her name, would not survive that long. "I've trained for this," he muttered under his breath. increasing his pace. "I can do this." He arrived at the loading bay just moments later, his boots echoing sharply against the cold metal floor. The sight that greeted him was nothing short of horrifying. The young Ivorian girl, Rena, as he later learned, lay crumpled against a pile of crates. Her translucent skin had turned a sickly gray, and the cracks in her crystalline body were growing wider with each passing second. Small wisps of smoke rose from the acidic fluid dripping from her wounds, and her eyes, once full of life, now appeared dim and clouded, as if she were fading away into oblivion. A small crowd of onlookers had gathered at a safe distance, murmuring in disbelief. None of them were willing to step closer. None of them dared to help. James took in the scene quickly, scanning the surroundings. The robotic workers had been ordered to keep a safe distance, their protocols preventing them from getting too close to the injured Ivorian. The few alien dock supervisors who were present had already turned their backs, clearly unwilling to risk exposure to her acidic biology. The sheer magnitude of the isolation that Rena must have felt in her final moments hit James hard. His heart ached for her, for the hopelessness she must have been experiencing. She was alone, and the universe seemed to have abandoned her. But not him. James pushed through the doubt, shaking off the fear that threatened to rise within him. The time for hesitation was over. He moved quickly toward Rena, his mind already shifting into doctor mode. There was no room for fear now, only action. "Kara," he called out, his voice calm yet firm. "Get me a med scanner, and I need lights over here." A fellow worker, one of the few who had dared to come close, scrambled to obey. The maintenance robots, though programmed to avoid direct contact with Ivorians, followed James's orders with surprising precision, illuminating the area around Rena with bright, focused lights. James knelt beside her, taking in the damage with a grim understanding. The fractures in her crystalline body were severe. The acidic fluid was already eating away at the metal floor, sending out small plumes of smoke as it reacted with the environment. His med scanner hummed to life in his hands, the display lighting up with a detailed readout of Rena's condition. Multiple fractures throughout her body, internal damage to her core crystalline structure, and the acid leaking from her wounds. It was clear that without immediate intervention, she would not survive. He had seen this before in his research, though never in real life. The Ivorian's body was delicate, fragile, and once it was damaged, it didn't take long for their systems to fail. Each second counted. James immediately reached into his medkit, pulling out a specialized compound designed to stabilize the fractures in non-carbon-based life forms. It was a delicate substance, one that mimicked the growth patterns of the Ivorian's crystal-based biology, allowing the body to begin healing itself. But it wasn't a cure. It was merely a temporary measure to buy enough time for proper treatment. He had to work fast. As he applied the compound, he spoke gently to Rena, despite knowing she couldn't fully understand him in her weakened state. Her universal translator was likely damaged in the accident, but James hoped his tone would offer some comfort. "I'm here, Rena," he said softly. "You're going to be okay. Just hold on." For a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes. Maybe it was just a glimmer of hope, but it was enough to drive him forward. The crowd of onlookers continued to watch from a distance, stunned and silent. The idea of a human approaching an injured Ivorian was nothing short of shocking to them. But to James, it was simple. Everyone deserved care, no matter their species. He carefully stabilized the largest of the fractures, knowing that if the damage spread too far, there would be no coming back. With each application of the stabilizing compound, he could see her color improving, though only slightly. The dark gray hue of her skin slowly shifted back to a lighter bluish tint. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give him hope. "Hold on," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "We're not done yet." As the minutes ticked by, James continued his work with methodical precision. He could feel the weight of the crowd's gaze on him, their disbelief mixing with something else. Perhaps awe, perhaps admiration. He had never been one for attention, but this moment wasn't about him. It was about saving Rena's life. Once the immediate stabilization was done, he turned to the comlink in his suit. Molecular reconstructor ready in medical bay. I need a crystal bed prepped immediately. We're moving her in 5 minutes. With Rena stabilized, he carefully applied a portable stasis field, ensuring her condition wouldn't deteriorate further during transport. The last thing he wanted was for her to fade away before they could get her to a proper treatment center. As James looked down at her, seeing the fragile hope in her eyes, he knew that he had made the right choice. In a galaxy full of countless species, in a place where indifference was the norm, he had chosen to act. He had chosen to stand up for what mattered: life. And no matter how difficult the journey ahead might be, he would make sure Rena had a chance to live it. The healing journey. The journey to the medical bay was long, but not long enough for James to let his guard down. As he carefully lifted the Ivorian girl into a portable stasis field, every step was measured, calculated. Her fragile body was suspended in the air, her translucent skin glowing faintly under the artificial lights. Despite the stabilization treatment, the damage to her crystalline structure was severe, and each breath she took seemed like a fragile promise to survive. James could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him with every step, but he pushed it aside. He had one goal now: to get her to the medical bay and give her a chance at life. His heart raced as he moved quickly through the corridors of the spaceport, the medical bay a distant but rapidly approaching destination. Despite the urgency, James remained focused. His mind replayed everything he had learned during his training: theories on xenobiology, emergency medical protocols, and the specific nuances of Ivorian physiology. But even the most rigorous training could not prepare him for the sight of Rena's lifeless form suspended in front of him, the faint glimmer of her crystalline structure only serving as a stark reminder of how tenuous life could be. The station's halls were eerily quiet, except for the hum of the transport units and the occasional clang of metal. As he moved past small clusters of workers, none approached. The silence was suffocating, as if the entire spaceport had come to a standstill, unwilling to acknowledge what was happening. It was as though Rena, an Ivorian, a species that was seen as alien, distant, and often otherworldly, was unworthy of help in the eyes of most. James shook off the thoughts. It wasn't his job to fix their perceptions. His job was to save her. He reached the medical bay just as the stasis field began to fade, the glowing walls of the treatment room flickering to life. The sterile white walls and humming diagnostic machines created a stark contrast to the cold, gritty environment of the loading bay. The medical staff had already been alerted, and they hurried to prepare the necessary equipment for her treatment. But even they seemed uncertain, unsure of how to handle an Ivorian injury. The knowledge simply didn't exist in the station's database. They had no protocols for treating a species so fundamentally different from humans. But James didn't have time for their hesitation. He moved quickly to one of the diagnostic beds, a machine designed to accommodate the variety of alien species that passed through the station. It was fitted with an adjustable crystal bed, one of the few pieces of equipment capable of adapting to the Ivorian's unique physiology. The bed hummed to life as James carefully placed Rena onto it, ensuring that her body was positioned in a way that wouldn't exacerbate the injuries. "Start the molecular reconstructor," he instructed the medical team, his voice calm and authoritative. "And get the adaptive nanobots ready. She's not out of the woods yet." The medical team scrambled to comply, a few of them glancing at one another in confusion. But no one questioned James. He had earned their respect over the past few weeks. Though his specialty was human medicine, his expertise in xenobiology had made him a valuable asset in a station where the inhabitants were anything but human. Still, there was a nervousness in the air. This was beyond anything they had ever encountered. None of them had ever treated an Ivorian before. As the molecular reconstructor began to hum, sending waves of energy into Rena's body, James closely monitored her vitals. Her heartbeat was weak, but still present. Her breathing was shallow, and her crystal structure remained fragmented. The stabilizing compound had done its job in preventing further damage, but it was only a temporary fix. If she wasn't healed properly, if the fractures in her crystalline body weren't repaired in time, she would succumb to her injuries. James watched the nanobots at work, their microscopic machines moving through the cracks in Rena's body, attempting to regenerate the crystalline structure. They were designed to repair minor fractures, to heal the body at a cellular level. But the Ivorians were not like humans. They didn't have organs that could be easily healed or replaced. Their bodies were built from a complex lattice of crystalline materials that, when damaged, could disrupt their entire internal system. A quiet beep from the scanner interrupted his thoughts, and James quickly turned to see the status update. It was good news. The molecular reconstructor was having an effect. The cracks in Rena's body had started to close, slowly but steadily. Her color, which had been nearly drained of life, began to improve. The dull gray hue of her skin was replaced by a softer, bluish tone, though it still looked fragile. She wasn't out of danger yet, but James couldn't help but feel a surge of relief. "Keep it steady," James ordered, his voice still calm, but with an edge of urgency. "We need to ensure no further complications arise. Monitor her core temperature." As he worked, he kept a constant eye on the other medical staff, who were now assisting with the more mundane tasks. One was preparing a nutrient infusion necessary for the Ivorian's recovery, while another was checking the status of the surrounding machinery. The room buzzed with activity, but all of it felt secondary to Rena's condition. James knew the path ahead would be long. Healing an Ivorian wasn't as simple as treating a human. He couldn't rely on the standard medical tools. It would take patience, persistence, and a deep understanding of the delicate balance between biology and technology. But James had something else driving him, a belief in the value of life, in the inherent worth of every being, no matter their origin or their physical form. There were no shortcuts in medicine. The human body and mind could be resilient, but so could alien species. The key was in understanding, in adapting, in taking the time to learn. And James was determined to do just that. As the hours passed, Rena's condition stabilized further. The diagnostic machines continued their work, sending waves of healing energy through her crystal lattice system, repairing the damage done by the accident. But even as she began to heal, a new concern emerged. Rena was still unconscious, her eyes closed, and her breathing shallow. The healing process was a delicate one, and it would take time before she could regain full consciousness. James leaned back for a moment, allowing himself a small breath of relief. It had been a long journey from the loading dock to the medical bay, but they weren't done yet. The hardest part was still ahead of them, helping Rena to recover fully, understanding her species' unique biology, and ensuring that her injuries didn't leave lasting effects. But as he looked down at the now stable form of the Ivorian girl, her body gently glowing under the medical lights, James felt something he hadn't expected. Hope. Not just for Rena, but for the future. The future where humans and aliens could come together, not out of fear or disdain, but with mutual respect, understanding, and the will to help. And for the first time since the emergency alert had sounded, James Miller allowed himself a small smile. They were going to make it. The price of mercy. Days passed in the sterile white rooms of the Zeta 9 medical bay, and though Rena's condition had slowly improved, James knew the real challenge was just beginning. Her body had started to heal, thanks to the molecular reconstructor and the specialized stabilizing compounds, but the process was far from perfect. There were many things about Ivorian biology that humanity still didn't understand. Even with his expertise in xenobiology, James knew that much of this recovery was based on educated guesses. As he stood by Rena's bedside, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest, he couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. Her crystalline skin shimmered faintly under the lights, a soft glow that made her appear almost ethereal, but the damage was still visible. The fractures in her body were healing, yes, but the scars of her injury would remain forever. It was a harsh reminder of how fragile life could be, whether it was human or alien. James had seen his share of injuries, but the vulnerability of the Ivorian body struck him on a deeper level. In the hours between his shifts, James had pored over every piece of data on Ivorian physiology he could find. There was little to go on. Most of the research on Ivorians focused on their incredible technological achievements and their society, not on their biology. But in the absence of information, he had relied on his training, as well as instinct. And right now, his instincts were telling him that Rena needed more than just mechanical healing. She needed time to adjust, time to rebuild not just her body, but her mind. If he could keep her stable long enough, if he could ensure the fractures didn't cause further internal damage, she might have a chance. But this came at a cost. Each day, James had to fight against the limitations of the medical equipment. Though the station had state-of-the-art facilities, they were designed primarily for humans. Some of the treatments required for an Ivorian recovery simply didn't exist on Zeta 9. His work was becoming more experimental with every passing hour, and James couldn't help but wonder if he was pushing his luck. At the same time, James couldn't shake the growing realization that the spaceport had all but forgotten about Rena. Her condition had barely made a ripple beyond the medical team. After all, she was just one Ivorian among thousands of other passengers, traders and workers passing through Zeta 9 every day. Humanity, it seemed, had a tendency to treat alien lives with a mix of awe and indifference. They marveled at the advances in alien technology, fascinated by the various species that roamed the galaxy, but when it came to offering true help, humanity's compassion seemed to waver. Rena's own people, the Ivorians, had long ago isolated themselves from the rest of the galaxy, proud in their accomplishments but hesitant to trust anyone beyond their borders. It was something James understood on an intellectual level, but as he looked at Rena's pale, glowing form, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of frustration. Why had it taken a human to step in? Why had no one else offered help when it was needed most? He didn't have the answers, and he wasn't sure he ever would. As the days wore on, James found himself visiting Rena at all hours, monitoring her progress, tweaking her treatments, and constantly learning more about the complexities of her species. He found himself drawn to her, not just as a patient, but as an individual. There was something about her quiet strength, even in her unconscious state, that fascinated him. He knew little about the Ivorians beyond the basic biological information, but he couldn't ignore the thought that Rena's survival might symbolize something greater, something about humanity's potential to bridge the gap between vastly different species. One day, as James entered the medical bay for his routine checkup, he found himself faced with an unexpected visitor. "Dr. Miller," came the voice from behind him. It was Dr. Atal Andoran, the station's medical director. The tall, angular centurion approached with a purposeful gait, his forearms folded in a traditional sign of caution. His glowing yellow eyes flicked to Rena's form, then back to James. "We need to talk," Atal said. James turned slowly, his hand resting lightly on the console that monitored Rena's vitals. "What is it, Atal?" Atal's mandibles clicked slightly, a gesture James had come to recognize as a sign of discomfort. "The station board has reviewed the incident, Miller. They're concerned about the level of resources you've been dedicating to this patient. The Ivorian. We've been monitoring her recovery, and though she seems stable, we've reached a point where our resources are stretched thin." James frowned, feeling a twinge of unease. He'd expected this, but hearing it from Atal made it no less unsettling. "Are you saying we should stop?" James asked, his voice measured. Atal's mandibles clicked again, a soft rasp of tension. "I'm saying that we need to think about the cost of continuing this treatment. We're doing everything we can, but the situation is complex. Ivorian biology is difficult. Even your methods, as innovative as they are, cannot be sustained indefinitely without consequences. You are taking resources from other critical operations. We cannot afford to continue indefinitely." James clenched his jaw, trying to contain his frustration. The cold reality of spaceport politics was settling in, and it was something he had hoped to avoid. Atoll wasn't wrong. Zeta-9 was a busy hub, and resources had to be allocated with care. But in his heart, James couldn't help but feel that Rena was worth the cost. She wasn't just another alien specimen to be discarded when it became inconvenient. "She's alive, Atoll," James replied firmly. "And she's getting better. We're making progress. We can't just give up on her." Atoll's eyes narrowed, the faintest glow flickering in his gaze. "It's not about giving up, Miller. It's about making choices. If we continue pouring resources into this, there will be consequences. More workers will be forced to reduce their hours. Other patients might be left without care. You're asking us to risk too much for a single individual." James felt his pulse quicken as the conversation continued to swirl around him, each word leaving him feeling more and more alienated. He had come to this station with a sense of duty to his fellow humans, but now he saw the broader picture. The vastness of the galaxy, with its myriad species and complex networks, wasn't just a wonder. It was also a reminder of how small each individual could feel, and how easily life, alien or human, could be overlooked. "I understand the risks," James said, his voice low but steady. "But I'm not asking you to risk everything. I'm asking for the time to see if she can survive. If I can help her make it through. We can't just turn our backs." Atoll didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced over at Rena's bed, where the soft, glowing lines of her crystal body shimmered faintly in the dim light. For a long moment, the Centurion stood in silence, contemplating. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Very well," he said. "But remember, Miller, every decision has a price. Be prepared for the consequences, whatever they may be." James exhaled deeply, the weight of Atall's words settling in his chest. As he turned back to Rena, he made a silent vow to her. He would do everything he could to save her. The cost, whatever it might be, was worth it. Because in the end, it wasn't just about the price of mercy. It was about proving that humanity could offer something more. Something better. And if he could do that for Rena, it would mean more than any decision the station's board could make. He wasn't giving up on her. Not now, not ever. A flicker of consciousness. The days turned into a blur of diagnostics, treatments, and fleeting moments of rest for James Miller. The medical bay became his second home, and Rena, though still unconscious, remained at the center of his world. Despite the external calm of the station, there was an ever-growing sense of urgency surrounding her condition. Her body, though healing, was not responding as quickly as James had hoped. The cracks in her crystalline structure had closed, but the underlying damage to her core was taking much longer to stabilize than anticipated. James spent hours at a time analyzing her vitals, adjusting the molecular reconstructor, and fine-tuning the nanobot infusion to accelerate the healing process. Every little improvement was met with a brief moment of relief, but those moments were becoming fewer and farther between. The more time he spent in the medical bay, the more he realized just how precarious her situation truly was. If her internal systems didn't stabilize soon, he feared the fractures might spread deeper, affecting her vital functions in ways that couldn't be repaired. He knew that the longer Rena remained unconscious, the more difficult it would be to revive her. Ivorians had a delicate balance between their crystal-based physiology and their neural systems, a balance that was becoming increasingly hard to restore. He had been warned about the risks, but James refused to believe that it was too late. He had always prided himself on his ability to find solutions where others saw only obstacles. And now, with Rena's life hanging in the balance, that resolve had never been stronger. On the 5th day since the accident, as James was adjusting the settings on the healing apparatus, something unexpected happened. A faint pulse came through the med scanner, one that made James pause mid-motion. His heart skipped a beat. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, an unmistakable sign that Rena's body was reacting to the treatment. The nanobots were working. Her vitals had shifted slightly. the faintest rise in her heart rate indicating a glimmer of activity. "Come on," James muttered to himself, stepping closer to her bedside. "Just a little more." He watched the monitor closely as Reina's body slowly began to respond. Her skin, once dull and lifeless, started to regain its subtle glow, the bluish tint of her skin returning slowly. Her breathing, once shallow and uneven, steadied as her body processed the nutrient infusion that James had carefully administered earlier. "Reina," he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. "I know you can hear me. Stay with me." He had spoken to her like this countless times in the past few days, though he knew she couldn't respond. It was a gesture of hope, a quiet assurance that he was there with her through the dark silence. He had spent hours by her side, silently urging her to awaken, but the hours had only stretched into days, with no indication that she would. Yet, this small change in her condition, a heartbeat, a breath, was enough to keep him going. The beeping of the medical equipment became more regular as Reina's vitals stabilized, but James knew better than to get too hopeful too quickly. Healing an Ivorian wasn't like treating a human. Their bodies were far more complex, their internal systems unlike anything he had encountered before. It was as though every step forward came with the risk of taking 2 steps back. But now, there was something new, something he hadn't felt before, a flicker of hope. Hours passed, and James found himself sitting beside Reina's bed, his tired eyes focused on her form, watching for any sign of further change. His body ached from exhaustion, but he pushed through. He had learned that there was no room for sleep, no time for rest when someone's life was in the balance. He was committed to seeing this through, to making sure that Reina didn't fade away into nothingness. Then, it happened. A low, soft groan escaped Reina's lips. James immediately stood up, his pulse racing with anticipation. He leaned closer, carefully monitoring her breathing. Her eyes, which had remained closed for so long, twitched slightly. The faintest flutter of her eyelids sent a rush of excitement through him. She was waking up. "Reina," he said softly, his voice a mix of relief and urgency. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes slowly opened, the soft glow in her iridescent skin flickering, as though she were struggling to make sense of her surroundings. The confusion in her expression was clear, and for a moment, she didn't seem to recognize where she was. James carefully reached out to touch her hand, hoping that his presence would provide some comfort. Reina's gaze shifted toward him, and for the first time since her injury, her lips parted to speak, but no sound came out. Her universal translator was still malfunctioning, a result of the damage she had sustained. Instead, she made a small, crystalline sound, an attempt to speak, but the words were lost in the void. "Don't worry," James reassured her softly. "You're safe. You're in the medical bay on Zeta 9. You've been through a lot, but you're going to be okay." Reina's eyes flickered toward the ceiling, as though trying to understand what was happening. She seemed disoriented, but there was something else there too, an awareness, a spark of life that had been missing for days. It was as if her mind was slowly waking up from a deep, unexplained slumber, the haze of unconsciousness lifting from her senses. James watched her carefully, noting the way her gaze moved across the room, taking in the unfamiliar sights. The station's stereo lights, the sound of the diagnostic machines beeping in the background. It all seemed foreign to her, but it was a good sign. She was becoming aware of her surroundings again. "Can you hear me?" he asked again, his voice gentle but insistent. This time, a soft, melodic sound escaped from Reina's lips, a clear, crystalline chime, almost like a soft hum. It wasn't a word, but it was an indication that she was trying to communicate, trying to respond to him in the way her species knew best. James smiled, a mixture of relief and gratitude flooding his chest. "You're doing great," he said quietly. "Just rest now. We've still got a long way to go." Reina's eyes met his, and for a brief moment, they held each other's gaze. The connection was fragile, fleeting, but it was real. In that moment, James felt something shift between them, not just as a medic and a patient, but as two beings who had crossed the boundaries of their respective worlds to help each other. He wasn't sure how long it would take for Rena to fully recover, or how many more challenges lay ahead for them both, but in the silence that followed her awakening, James felt a newfound sense of hope. It wasn't just about saving her. It was about building a bridge between humanity and the alien world she came from. And if Rena was willing to fight for her life, then so was he. "We'll get through this together," James whispered, more to himself than to her. The journey ahead would be difficult, filled with uncertainties, but for the first time in days, James felt certain of one thing: Rena wasn't going to give up. Neither was he. And together, they would find a way forward. The burden of responsibility. The medical bay had never felt as quiet as it did in the days following Rena's awakening. For the first time since her injury, the soft hum of the machines felt like a distant background to the steady rhythm of her breathing. James found himself sitting by her side, more often than not, his eyes fixed on her delicate form, watching for any signs of further recovery. Her condition had improved, but she was still far from being out of danger. Though the immediate threat of her survival had passed, there was still the matter of what remained. What would become of her once she was stable enough to leave the medical bay? As the days continued to blur together, James's mind remained focused on the future. There was an unsettling weight in his chest every time he looked at Rena. She had been through so much. She had fought so hard for survival. And yet now, her life seemed to be at the mercy of the complex medical treatments that were still working to heal her. The fractures in her crystalline form had healed, but there was a lingering uncertainty. The acid that had leaked from her wounds had done internal damage, affecting her nervous system in ways that James could not entirely understand. Her body was healing on the outside, but what of the damage inside? Rena's eyes would sometimes flutter open, her expression still clouded with confusion as she struggled to piece together the reality of her situation. The world around her, with its artificial lights and the cold metallic surfaces of the station, was far from what she was accustomed to. The Ivorians had once lived on a world rich with glowing crystals, their cities shining like jewels in the dark of space. This sterile, mechanical environment must have been a far cry from the beauty of her homeworld. James couldn't help but wonder what she thought as she slowly regained her senses. Did she remember the accident? Did she understand why she had ended up here, alone in a strange station, with a human by her side? Her species was known for its intelligence and pride, and James knew that the isolation Rena had likely felt during her recovery was not something she would have easily accepted. Still, she had not shown any signs of fear or hostility, which was a small comfort. Every time their eyes met, there was a silent understanding between them, something that transcended words and species. Yet, as much as he tried to comfort her with reassurances, James knew he couldn't shield her from the reality of what lay ahead. There was still the question of what the future would hold for an injured Ivorian who had been saved by a human. Would her people accept her return, assuming she even survived this ordeal? Or would they view her as a liability, someone who had failed to prove their strength in the face of danger? James's mind turned over these questions in the quiet hours when he was alone with Rena, and though he could not answer them, he knew one thing for certain. Rena's survival had made an impact far beyond just the walls of this station. It had set something into motion, a ripple through the fabric of his own beliefs, and possibly even through the larger, more complicated political and cultural dynamics of the galaxy. Days turned into weeks, and James continued to monitor Rena's recovery with a steady determination. She had begun to speak again, though her voice was faint and damaged from the trauma of her injury. Her universal translator still wasn't functioning properly, but she managed to convey basic thoughts through gestures, a few broken words, and the crystalline chimes that were the Ivorian's natural form of speech. James had become accustomed to this quiet communication, though it frustrated him at times. He wanted to hear her voice, to understand her completely, to know what she was thinking. But for now, He was content with what they had. One day, as he was adjusting the settings on her healing equipment, Rena's hand reached out toward his. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to stop him in his tracks. He turned to face her, watching as she tried to speak, her lips barely moving as she struggled to find the words. I remember. Rena's voice was a soft, melodic chime, barely audible but unmistakable in its intent. The crash. The pain. James froze, his heart tightening as he met her gaze. He had always known that Rena had memories of the accident, but hearing her voice crack through the silence made it real. She was remembering what had happened, the terror of being struck by the cargo container, the agony of being trapped, and the cold isolation that had followed. His heart ached for her, knowing that these memories, as painful as they were now part of her reality. "You're safe now," James whispered, his voice filled with a quiet urgency, as if saying the words aloud could somehow erase the pain she had endured. "We'll make sure nothing like that ever happens again. I'll keep you safe." Rena's hand tightened around his briefly, a silent agreement, but she didn't speak again. Her eyes closed, and she seemed to drift back into a light sleep, her body still recovering. James watched her for a long while, his mind swirling with thoughts of what lay ahead for her. He was beginning to realize that their bond, though forged through necessity, was growing into something more. He had never intended for this to happen. He had never expected to find himself caring so deeply for someone from an entirely different species, someone who had once seemed so distant and alien to him. But now, as he looked at Rena, he couldn't deny it. His feelings for her had evolved. She wasn't just a patient anymore. She wasn't just an Ivorian to be saved. She was a person, a living, breathing being who had faced unimaginable odds and who had shown a strength and resilience that left him in awe. And he was determined to help her through the next chapter of her life, no matter the cost. The weight of responsibility on his shoulders had only grown heavier as the days passed. He was no longer just her medic. He was her protector, her advocate, her link to a world beyond this sterile station. The spaceport, once bustling with life, now seemed smaller, more isolated, as James considered the next steps. The rest of the galaxy, the people who would view Rena's survival as either a miracle or an anomaly, was waiting for her, for them both. For the first time, James felt the full weight of what he had taken on. He wasn't just trying to save Rena's life. He was trying to create a future for her in a galaxy that didn't fully understand her people. A future where humans and Ivorians could coexist, where compassion and understanding could transcend cultural divides. But that future was uncertain. There were forces at play, both within the station and beyond, that would see this bond as a threat, as a disruption to the natural order of things. James knew that their journey was far from over. As Rena's recovery continued, so too would the challenges they faced. The path ahead would be fraught with uncertainty, filled with political struggles, cultural misunderstandings, and potential dangers from both human and alien factions. But one thing was certain: he wasn't backing down. He had chosen this path, and no matter the obstacles, he would fight for Rena's survival, for her future, and for the hope of something greater than the isolated, disconnected existence that had defined the galaxy for so long. Together, they would face whatever came next, and James, with all his resolve, was ready to carry that burden, no matter the cost.